The bullet that grazed Robert Sullivan's shoulder in the summer of 1878 should have killed him, but death had refused his company too many times for him to believe it would ever truly come. He sat alone in the dusty saloon in Cheyenne, Wyoming territory, watching the amber whiskey swirl in his glass while the world moved around him like he was already a ghost. The wound had healed months ago, leaving only a puckered scar and the familiar weight of knowing that tomorrow would bring nothing but more of the same emptiness. Robert was 30 years old, which felt ancient in a profession where most men died before seeing 25. He had been a cowboy, a ranch hand, a drover, and briefly, a man who wore a tin star until he realized that justice was just another word for choosing which kind of wrong you could live with. Now he drifted between cattle drives and odd jobs, saving money for a future he could not picture and did not want. The saloon doors swung open, letting in a blast of October wind that carried the scent of coming snow. Robert barely glanced up. Cheyenne was growing fast, swollen with railroad money, and the kind of people who believed tomorrow held promise. He had stopped believing in promise around the same time he buried his younger brother in a shallow grave outside Abilene, killed over a card game that neither of them should have been playing. Mr. Sullivan. The voice was uncertain, belonging to a boy who could not have been more than 14, all gangly limbs and nervous energy. Robert looked up, his gray eyes flat and distant. "That depends on what you are selling." "Nothing, sir. I got a message from Doc Henderson. Says there is a lady who needs help getting her wagon fixed, and she is offering to pay. Says you are good with your hands and could use the work." Robert wanted to refuse. The last thing he needed was to play hero for some settler woman whose husband had probably run off or drunk himself to death. But his funds were running low and winter was coming. He would need money for a room and food unless he wanted to freeze in some lined shack waiting for spring. "Where?" he asked, draining his whiskey. "Just outside town, near Miller's Crossing. The wagon has a broken axle." Robert stood, his tall frame unfolding with the kind of weariness that had nothing to do with physical exhaustion. He dropped a coin on the table and followed the boy out into the bright afternoon sun that made his eyes ache. The walk to Miller's Crossing took 20 minutes, and with each step, Robert felt the familiar numbness that had become his constant companion. He had stopped feeling much of anything after his brother died. Anger, yes, sometimes that flared hot and quick. But joy, hope, anticipation, all of those had dried up like a creek bed in August. The wagon was easy to spot, tilted at an awkward angle off the main road. It was a simple farm wagon, nothing fancy, loaded with crates and barrels covered by canvas tarps. A single horse stood in the traces, looking patient and long-suffering. And standing beside the wagon, hands on her hips and frustration written across her face, was a woman who made Robert stop in his tracks. She was not beautiful in the delicate way that men usually described women. Her features were too strong for that, her jaw too determined, her nose slightly crooked like it had been broken and healed without proper setting. But there was something arresting about her, something that cut through the fog in Robert's mind like sunlight through storm clouds. Her dark hair was pulled back in a practical braid, and her dress, though worn and dusty, was clean. She looked to be in her middle 20s, with the kind of capable air that suggested she had been taking care of herself for a long time. "Are you the man Doc Henderson sent?" she asked, her voice carrying a hint of the South, smooth and warm like honey. "Robert Sullivan," he said, touching the brim of his hat. "I heard you need an axle fixed." "Nora Grant," she replied, offering her hand like a man would. Robert shook it, surprised by the firm grip and the calluses on her palm. "The axle cracked about 2 miles back. I managed to limp this far, but it gave out completely." Robert crouched down to examine the damage. The axle had not just cracked but had split clean through, a catastrophic failure that suggested either rotten wood or too much weight. "This is not something I can fix here. You will need a new axle entirely." Nora's shoulders sagged slightly. "How much is that going to cost?" "The axle itself, maybe $15 if we can find one already made. Otherwise, we will have to have one turned, which will take time and cost more. Then there is the labor of installing it." She closed her eyes briefly, and Robert saw her calculating costs she probably could not afford. When she opened them again, there was steel in her expression. "What if I help with the labor? Would that bring the cost down?" Robert stood, dusting off his hands. "You know how to work on wagons." "I know how to follow instructions, and I am stronger than I look. My father was a wheelwright before he died. I picked up a few things." There was something about her determination that tugged at something buried deep in Robert's chest, something he had thought was long dead. "We will need to get the wagon into town. I can ride back and bring a team to pull it." "But that is going to be another expense." "I can pay," Nora said quickly. "I have money, I just need to be careful with it." Robert studied her for a moment. The sun was behind her, turning the edges of her hair into a halo of gold and bronze. "Why are you out here alone? Where is your husband?" Her expression shuddered immediately, closing off like a door slamming shut. "I do not have a husband, it is just me." The way she said it told Robert not to push, so he did not. Instead, he nodded. "I will be back within the hour. Stay with the wagon and keep an eye out. This road does not see much traffic, but you never know." He turned to walk back to town, but her voice stopped him. "Mr. Sullivan, thank you. I know you do not know me, but I appreciate the help." Robert glanced back. She was watching him with an expression he could not quite read, something between hope and wariness. "Do not thank me yet. I have not done anything." The walk back to town felt different somehow, like the world had shifted slightly on its axis. Robert could not shake the image of Nora Grant standing beside her broken wagon, chin lifted in defiance of whatever circumstances had brought her to Wyoming territory alone, and apparently without much money. He told himself it was none of his business, that he would help her fix the wagon, take his pay, and move on like he always did. But something about her had gotten under his skin, and that worried him more than he wanted to admit. Doc Henderson was easy to find, making his rounds at the boarding house where he kept an office. He was a portly man in his 50s with kind eyes and a tendency to meddle in other people's business out of genuine concern rather than nosiness. "Ah, Robert," the doc said, looking up from the ledger he was writing in. "You found Miss Grant all right." "I did. I need to borrow a team to pull her wagon into town. The axle is completely split." Doc Henderson frowned. "That is unfortunate. Poor girl has had nothing but bad luck since she arrived in Wyoming." Robert felt his curiosity stir despite himself. "How long has she been here?" "About 6 months. Came from Georgia, I believe, though she does not talk much about her past. She has been working at the boarding house, cleaning rooms and helping with laundry. Sarah, the owner, says she is the hardest worker she has ever seen. Saves every penny." "What is she doing with a wagon full of supplies then?" Doc Henderson's expression grew cautious, like he was deciding how much to share. "She has been saving up to start a small farm. Bought a piece of land about 10 miles north of town, near the Laramie River. Not much, just 40 acres, but the soil is decent and there is water. She is planning to move out there before winter sets in completely." Robert felt something twist in his chest. The image of Nora Grant trying to work a farm alone through a Wyoming winter was both admirable and terrifying. That is a fool's errand. She will never make it through the winter alone. "I know," the doc said quietly. I have tried to talk her out of it, but she is as stubborn as they come. Says she would rather die free on her own land than spend another year working for someone else. There was a story there, Robert knew, something that had driven Nora to risk everything for a patch of land and the illusion of independence. He wanted to know what it was, which surprised him. He had stopped being curious about people a long time ago. Can I borrow the team or not? Robert asked, steering the conversation back to practical matters. Of course. Frank at the livery owes me a favor. Tell him I sent you. Within the hour, Robert was driving a team of sturdy draft horses back toward Miller's Crossing, a length of chain rattling in the wagon bed behind him. The afternoon sun was starting to slant toward evening, painting the prairie in shades of gold and amber. It was beautiful in a stark, lonely way, and Robert had long ago stopped noticing. Nora was exactly where he had left her, though she had climbed into the wagon bed and was reorganizing the supplies, lashing them down more securely. She looked up when she heard the team approaching, relief washing over her face. I was starting to worry, she admitted, climbing down. Thought maybe you had changed your mind. I said I would help, Robert replied, swinging down from the wagon. I keep my word. Together they worked to hitch the chain to Nora's disabled wagon, and Robert was impressed by how quickly she understood what needed to be done and how efficiently she moved. Her father must have taught her well. When everything was secured, Robert climbed back onto the borrowed wagon and started the team forward slowly, carefully pulling Nora's wagon back onto the road and then toward town. Nora walked alongside, keeping pace with the horses. Robert could have offered her a seat beside him, but something told him she would refuse. She had the air of someone who had learned not to accept charity unless absolutely necessary. The sun was setting by the time they reached Cheyenne, painting the sky in violent shades of purple and red. Robert guided the wagons to the wheelwright's shop, where a balding man named Morrison was just closing up for the day. Got an emergency repair, Robert called out. Broken axle. Morrison looked at the wagon, then at the sky, then back at Robert. It will have to wait until morning. I cannot see to work in the dark. That is fine, Nora said, stepping forward. Is there somewhere safe I can leave the wagon overnight? You can pull it around back. I will keep an eye on it. Morrison squinted at her in the fading light. You are the girl who bought the Parker place, are not you? I am, Nora confirmed. Morrison grunted. That is rough country for farming. You have experience? Some, Nora said, her tone suggesting she was used to this kind of skepticism. I will manage, if you say so. Morrison turned his attention to the wagon. I will look at this first thing in the morning. Might have an axle that will fit. If not, it will take me a day or two to make one. Nora's face fell. A day or two? I cannot afford to wait that long. Winter is coming, and I need to get my supplies to the property and get some kind of shelter built. Cannot make wood dry faster than it wants to, miss. These things take time. Robert watched Nora's jaw tighten, saw her hands curl into fists at her sides. She was fighting not to cry, he realized, fighting not to show how much this setback hurt. Something in his chest cracked open, just a little, and before he could stop himself, he heard his own voice saying, "What if I help him?" 2 sets of hands could cut the time in half. Both Morrison and Nora turned to stare at him. Morrison looked skeptical, but Nora's expression was pure shock. You would do that? She asked. Robert immediately regretted the offer. He should walk away, take whatever small payment Nora could afford for today's work and disappear back into his comfortable numbness. But those eyes were fixed on him, dark and desperate and hopeful, and he found he could not take the words back. I would, he said, but it will cost you. Nora straightened. How much? Not money. Food. If you are planning to farm, I am guessing you can cook. I am tired of saloon meals and my own bad coffee. You feed me while we work on the wagon, and we will call it even for my labor." It was a ridiculous bargain, vastly in her favor, and they both knew it. Morrison snorted but said nothing. Nora studied Robert like she was trying to figure out the trick, the hidden cost. "Why?" she finally asked. "Why would you help me?" Robert did not have a good answer for that. He did not understand it himself. "Does it matter?" "Yes," Nora said firmly. "It matters. I do not take charity and I do not owe men favors. So if this is some kind of trick or you are expecting something other than food in return, you can forget it right now." The bluntness of her words should have offended him, but instead, Robert felt a flicker of respect. She had clearly learned to protect herself the hard way. "No trick," he said quietly. "Just a man who is tired of eating alone and a woman who needs her wagon fixed. Simple as that." Nora held his gaze for a long moment, and Robert had the strange sensation of being seen for the first time in years, really seen, not just glanced at and dismissed. Finally, she nodded. "All right. You have a deal, Mr. Sullivan." "Robert," he corrected. "Robert," she repeated, and the way she said his name did something odd to his pulse. "I am staying at the boarding house on 3rd Street. Do you know it?" "I do. Meet me there at first light. I will have breakfast ready." She turned to Morrison. "And I will be here as soon as we eat to help with the wagon." Morrison waved a hand dismissively. "Suit yourself, but stay out of the way if you do not know what you are doing." Nora's smile was sharp. "I will try." Robert helped her pull the wagon around to Morrison's storage area, and then returned the borrowed team to the livery. By the time he was done, full dark had fallen, and the streets of Cheyenne were lit by scattered lanterns and the glow from saloon windows. He should have been hungry, should have been thinking about getting a drink and a meal, but instead, he found himself standing in the street outside the boarding house, looking up at the lit windows and wondering which one was Nora's. He had agreed to help a stranger, had volunteered his time and labor for nothing more than a few meals. It was not like him. Nothing about today was like him. For 3 years, Robert had moved through life like a man underwater, everything muffled and distant. And now, after one afternoon with a stubborn woman and her broken wagon, he felt something stirring in his chest that might have been interest, might have been curiosity, might have been the first faint pulse of something dangerously close to hope. And that terrified him more than any gunfight ever had. Tomorrow would bring more of the same, he told himself. Tomorrow he would help fix the wagon, collect his meals, and send Nora Grant off to her foolish dream of farming alone. And then everything would go back to the way it was, empty and safe and numb. But as Robert walked toward the hotel where he kept a room, he could not shake the feeling that tomorrow had just become a great deal more complicated than he had planned. And for the first time in 3 years, he was not entirely sure he minded. The boarding house dining room smelled like coffee and fresh biscuits when Robert arrived just after dawn. The sun was barely above the horizon, painting the world in shades of pale blue and pink. He found Nora in the kitchen, an apron tied over her dress, working alongside a plump older woman who he assumed was Sarah, the owner Doc Henderson had mentioned. "Right on time," Nora said, glancing up from the pan of eggs she was scrambling. "Sarah, this is Robert Sullivan." "Robert, Sarah Mitchell. She owns this place." Sarah looked him over with the practiced eye of someone who had seen every kind of man the West had to offer. Whatever she saw must have passed muster because she nodded. "Heard you are helping our Nora with her wagon. That is decent of you." "Just a job," Robert said, uncomfortable with the warmth in her tone. "Sit," Nora instructed, pointing to a small table in the corner. "Food will be ready in a minute." Robert sat, feeling oddly out of place in the domestic warmth of the kitchen. He was used to eating standing up or hunched over a campfire. used to meals that were fuel and nothing more. When Nora set a plate in front of him piled high with eggs, biscuits, bacon, and fried potatoes, he stared at it for a moment before picking up his fork. The food was excellent, seasoned just right and cooked with obvious care. Robert ate steadily, aware of Nora moving around the kitchen, cleaning up and preparing food for the boarding house guests. She moved with economical grace, no wasted motion, someone who had learned to work hard and work smart. "You did not have to make this much," Robert said between bites. Nora glanced over her shoulder. "A deal is a deal. You work, you eat well. That was the agreement." "Most people would have given me coffee and day-old bread." "I am not most people," Nora said simply. No, Robert thought, she definitely was not. They finished breakfast in comfortable silence, and then Nora grabbed a basket she had prepared. "Lunch," she explained. "Figured we would be working through the noon hour." Morrison was already at work when they arrived at the shop, examining Nora's broken axle with a critical eye. "It is worse than I thought," he announced. "The whole thing is rotten. Whoever sold you this wagon cheated you." Nora's expression tightened, but she did not argue. "Can you fix it?" "I have an axle that should work, but it will need to be cut down to size and fitted proper. It is a full day's work, maybe more." "Then we better get started," Robert said, shrugging out of his coat. The work was hard and precise, requiring constant measurement and adjustment. Morrison directed while Robert, and to the wheelwright's obvious surprise, Nora did much of the physical labor. She knew her way around tools, could read a measuring stick, and was not afraid to get her hands dirty. More than once, Robert caught Morrison looking at her with grudging respect. By midday, they had made good progress. Nora unpacked the lunch basket, revealing thick sandwiches, pickles, and slices of apple pie. They ate in Morrison's small office, dusty and cluttered but out of the wind. "Where did you learn to work with wood?" Robert asked Nora. "My father, like I said. He was a wheelwright in Georgia, had his own shop. I grew up watching him work, helping when I got old enough." Her voice went soft. "He was a good man, died when I was 16. "I am sorry," Robert said, and meant it. Nora shrugged, but he could see the old pain in her eyes. "It was a long time ago. What about you? How did you end up drifting around Wyoming territory?" Robert took a bite of sandwich to buy himself time. He did not like talking about the past, about the choices that had brought him to this point. "Grew up in Kansas. Worked cattle most of my life. Lost my brother a few years back and decided to move on." It was the truth, stripped bare of all the details that made it hurt. Nora seemed to understand what he was not saying because she did not push. "I am sorry about your brother," she said quietly. "Like you said, it was a long time ago." But it was not really. 3 years felt like yesterday and a lifetime ago all at once. They worked through the afternoon, the new axle slowly taking shape under Morrison's exacting standards. The old wheelwright was a perfectionist, refusing to accept anything less than exact tolerances. It was frustrating and time-consuming, but Robert had to admit the man knew his craft. As the sun started to set, Morrison finally declared the axle ready to install. The three of them worked together to lift Nora's wagon, remove the broken axle, and slide the new one into place. It was heavy, awkward work that left them all sweating despite the October chill. "That should hold," Morrison said, testing the wheels. "But take it easy for the first few miles. Let everything settle in." Nora sagged with relief. "Thank you, all of you. What do I owe you?" Morrison named a price that was fair, and Nora counted out the money without hesitation, though Robert noticed how thin her coin purse looked afterward. She had spent nearly everything she had on supplies and the land, he realized. This repair had probably wiped out whatever cushion she might have had. "I will help you get the wagon to your property," Robert heard himself say. "Make sure the axle holds up and help you unload." Both Morrison and Nora stared at him again, and Robert wondered when he had lost his mind. He should walk away now, should let Nora Grant drive off into her uncertain future while he went back to his certain emptiness. "That is not necessary," Nora said, but there was hope in her voice that betrayed her words. "The road north is rough," Robert insisted. "And if something goes wrong, you will be stranded in the middle of nowhere. I will ride along, make sure you get there safe. Then I will head back." Nora bit her lip, clearly torn between pride and practicality. Practicality won. "All right, but I am paying you for your time." "You are feeding me," Robert countered. "That is payment enough. You are not making any sense, you know that," Nora said, but she was smiling slightly. "Why are you doing this?" Robert did not have an answer, at least not one he was ready to say out loud. How could he explain that for the first time in 3 years, he felt something other than emptiness? That watching her fight for her small dream of independence had reminded him that people could still want things, could still hope for things, even when the world seemed determined to grind them down. "Maybe I am just curious to see if you can actually do it," he said instead. "Farm that land alone." "I can do it," Nora said with absolute conviction. "I will do it." And looking at the fierce determination in her eyes, Robert almost believed her. They agreed to leave at first light the next morning. Robert spent the evening preparing for the trip, gathering supplies and checking his horse, a sturdy buckskin gelding named Buck. He tried not to think too hard about what he was doing, about the fact that he was delaying his return to the empty drifting that had become his life. He told himself it was just a few days, that he would help Nora get settled and then leave, and everything would go back to normal. But that night, lying in his hotel room and staring at the ceiling, Robert could not shake the image of Nora standing beside her broken wagon, chin lifted in defiance. Could not stop thinking about the way she moved through the world with purpose and determination, like she knew exactly where she was going even if the path was hard. She reminded him of who he used to be before his brother died, before he gave up on the idea that tomorrow could be anything other than empty. And that was dangerous because it made him wonder if maybe, just maybe, he had given up too soon. The morning was cold and clear when they set out, Nora driving her wagon while Robert rode alongside on Buck. The road north followed the Laramie River Valley, winding through grassland and scattered cottonwood groves. The leaves had turned gold and were falling, carpeting the ground in bright color. It was beautiful country, harsh but honest, and Robert found himself noticing details he had long ignored. The way the morning light caught on the river, the sound of geese flying south in perfect formation, the smell of sage and dry grass. Nora drove with the focused competence of someone who had done it many times before, handling the reins with easy confidence. They did not talk much, both of them comfortable with the silence, but it was not the heavy silence of loneliness that Robert was used to. It felt companionable, peaceful even. They stopped at midday to rest the horses and eat the food Nora had packed. She had insisted on making breakfast again that morning, and Robert was starting to realize that her insistence on feeding him well was not just about their bargain. It was about pride, about showing that she could take care of herself and others, that she was not some helpless woman who needed rescuing. "How much farther?" Robert asked, biting into a thick roast beef sandwich. "Another few hours, I think. The property is near where the river bends east. There is a stand of cottonwoods and a natural spring. That is where I plan to build." "You have building materials," Nora gestured to the wagon. "Some. Enough for a small cabin if I am careful. I will need to cut more timber, but there are trees on the property." "I have tools and I know how to use them." Robert studied her, this woman who planned to build her own house and work her own land. "You are serious about this, about doing it all yourself?" "I have to be," Nora said quietly. "I do not have anyone else to rely on." "What about family, friends?" Her expression closed off slightly. "My mother died when I was young. My father, like I said, when I was 16. I have a sister in Georgia, but she has her own family to worry about, and I could not stay there, not after what happened." Robert waited, sensing there was more to the story. Nora stared at the river, her sandwich forgotten in her hands. "I was engaged," she said finally, "to a man my father approved of before he died. Marcus was from a good family, had money, seemed respectable. Everyone said I was lucky to have caught his attention." Her voice turned bitter. "Took me almost a year to realize that he did not want a wife. He wanted property that could cook and clean and look pretty at church. He wanted someone he could control." Robert felt anger stir in his chest, hot and immediate. "Did he hurt you?" he tried, Nora said flatly. "Once. I broke his nose with a fireplace poker and left that same night. Took what little money I had saved and bought a train ticket west. Figured if I was going to be alone anyway, I might as well be alone somewhere I could make my own choices." The pieces clicked into place, explaining her wariness, her fierce independence, her determination to rely on no one but herself. Robert understood that impulse. He had done the same thing after his brother died, had run from everything familiar because the pain of staying was too great. "He does not know where you are?" Robert asked. "No one does. I used a different name when I bought the train ticket, did not tell anyone where I was going. As far as anyone in Georgia knows, I disappeared. And that is exactly how I want it." Robert nodded slowly. "Your secret is safe with me." Nora looked at him, really looked at him, and something passed between them, an understanding, a recognition. They were both running from the past, both trying to build something new out of the wreckage of what had been. "Thank you," she said softly. They finished their meal in silence and then pressed on. The afternoon light turned golden as they climbed slightly higher, following the river into more broken country. Robert kept watch, old instincts alert for danger, but they saw no one. This land was empty, caught between the settled areas around Cheyenne and the wilder territories to the north. As the sun began its descent toward the horizon, Nora pointed ahead. "There. That is the property." Robert saw the stand of cottonwoods she had mentioned, their golden leaves brilliant in the late afternoon sun. The river curved around a small rise, and he could see the dark line of a creek feeding into it. The land rolled gently, a mix of grassland and scattered trees, sheltered from the worst winds by low hills to the north and west. It was not prime farming country, but it had water and timber and looked defensible. With hard work, it could support a small farm. "It is beautiful," Robert said, and meant it. Nora's face lit up with a smile that transformed her features, making her look younger and unguarded. "It is mine. 40 acres of my own land where no one can tell me what to do or who to be. I know it does not look like much now, but I can see it, Robert. I can see the cabin built, the fields planted, the garden growing. I can see a real home." The passion in her voice stirred something in Robert's chest, something that felt dangerously like longing. He had given up on the idea of home years ago, had convinced himself that he was better off drifting, that tomorrow would always be empty no matter where he was. But listening to Nora describe her dreams, he felt the faintest whisper of doubt in that conviction. They drove the wagon to the spot Nora had chosen for her cabin, a level area beneath the cottonwoods with a clear view of the surrounding land. The spring she had mentioned bubbled up from between rocks, forming a small pool before trickling down to join the creek. It was perfect, Robert had to admit, sheltered but not hemmed in, with good access to water and natural beauty that made the harsh landscape seem almost gentle. "We should unload before it gets dark," Robert said, swinging down from Buck. They worked together as the sun set, carrying crates and barrels from the wagon to a spot beneath the largest cottonwood where they would be protected from dew. Nora had been smart in her purchases, Robert saw. She had tools, seeds for spring planting, dried goods, blankets, a small stove, everything she would need to survive. She had also brought a tent, which she set up with practiced efficiency as Robert tended to the horses. By the time full dark fell, they had a small camp established. Nora cooked a simple meal over the fire, beans and bacon and coffee, and they ate sitting on a fallen log, watching the stars emerge overhead. The night was clear and cold, the sky so full of stars it looked like someone had spilled diamonds across black velvet. "I have never seen stars like this in Georgia," Nora said softly. "Too many trees, too much humidity, but here it is like you can see forever." Robert looked up, remembering the first time he had seen the western sky, how vast and overwhelming it had seemed. It can make you feel small or free. "I have never decided which." "Maybe both," Nora said. "Maybe that is the point." They sat in companionable silence for a while, the fire crackling and the river whispering in the background. Robert felt more at peace than he had in years, and that scared him. Peace was dangerous. Peace made you soft, made you forget that life could take everything from you in a heartbeat. "You should get some sleep," he said abruptly. "Tomorrow is going to be a long day." Nora looked at him curiously but did not argue. "Where are you going to sleep?" "I will take the first watch." "Make sure nothing bothers the horses." "Robert, you do not have to do that. We are safe here." "Probably," he agreed, "but I will feel better keeping an eye out anyway." Nora studied him for a moment, and Robert had the uncomfortable feeling that she could see right through his excuses to the truth underneath. He did not want to sleep because he did not want to dream, did not want to risk the nightmares that sometimes came. Memories of his brother's death played out in brutal detail. "All right," she said finally, "but wake me in a few hours. We can split the watch." Robert wanted to argue, but he knew that stubborn tilt to her jaw. "Deal." Nora disappeared into her tent, and Robert added more wood to the fire before settling against a tree where he could see the whole camp. Buck stood nearby, his ears flicking occasionally but otherwise calm. The night was quiet except for the usual sounds: wind in the cottonwoods, the river, something small rustling in the grass. Robert let his mind wander, something he usually avoided. Thinking led to remembering, and remembering led to pain. But tonight, his thoughts kept circling back to Nora, to her determination and her dreams, to the way she moved through the world with purpose. She had been hurt, had been betrayed by someone who should have protected her, and yet she had not let that destroy her. She had taken her pain and her anger and turned it into fuel, used it to build something new. Robert had done the opposite. When his brother died, he had let it hollow him out, had embraced the emptiness because feeling nothing was easier than feeling everything. He had convinced himself that tomorrow would always be empty, that there was no point in hoping or planning or dreaming. And for 3 years, that had been enough. Or if not enough, at least bearable. But now, sitting in the starlight and listening to the river sing, Robert wondered if he had been wrong, if maybe tomorrow did not have to be empty, if maybe there was still room in his battered heart for something other than grief and numbness. The thought terrified him, but it also felt like the first breath after being underwater too long, sharp and painful and necessary. He woke Nora a few hours later as promised, and she emerged from the tent wrapped in a blanket, her hair loose around her shoulders. In the firelight, she looked softer, younger, and Robert felt his breath catch slightly. "Anything happen?" she asked, settling onto the log. Nothing. It is quiet. Good. She glanced at his bedroll, which he had not touched. Are you going to actually sleep or just lie there pretending? Robert felt his mouth quirk slightly. You are observant. I pay attention, Nora said. You do not strike me as someone who sleeps easy. Not usually, no. Bad dreams. Robert hesitated, then nodded. Sometimes. Nora did not pry, and he was grateful. Instead, she said, my sister used to have nightmares after our mother died. I would sit with her until she fell back asleep. Sometimes just knowing someone else is nearby helps. It was an offer, gently made, and Robert felt something warm unfurl in his chest. I will be all right, but thank you. He lay down on his bedroll, not bothering to remove his boots, and closed his eyes. He did not expect to sleep, but the warmth of the fire and the quiet sound of Nora humming softly to herself worked some kind of magic. For the first time in months, Robert drifted off without fighting it, and his dreams, when they came, were not of death and blood but of golden cottonwood leaves and a woman's smile. He woke to the smell of coffee and bacon, sunlight filtering through the trees. Nora was already up and working, the fire rebuilt and breakfast cooking. She looked up when she heard him moving and smiled. Morning, sleepyhead. I was starting to think you would sleep all day. Robert sat up, feeling more rested than he had in a long time. What time is it? About 7. The horses are fed and watered, and breakfast is almost ready. I thought we could start laying out the cabin foundation after we eat. Robert blinked at her energy, this woman who had been keeping watch a few hours ago and was now bustling around like she had slept for 10 hours. You do not believe in taking it slow, do you? Cannot afford to, Nora said cheerfully. Winter is coming, and I have a lot of work to do before it arrives. Now come eat before it gets cold. They spent the morning clearing the ground where Nora wanted to build her cabin, removing rocks and brush and leveling the earth. It was hard physical labor, the kind that left muscles aching and sweat soaking through shirts, despite the October chill. But it was also satisfying, tangible progress that Robert could see taking shape. Nora worked beside him without complaint, hauling rocks and digging post holes with the same determination she brought to everything else. Robert found himself watching her when he thought she was not looking, noticing the way the sun caught in her hair, the way she bit her lip when she was concentrating, the rare moments when she would stop and look around at her land with an expression of such pure joy that it made his chest ache. By midday, they had the outline of the cabin marked and the first post holes dug. They broke for lunch, collapsing in the shade and passing a canteen of water back and forth. How long do you think it will take to build the cabin? Robert asked. Nora considered. With 2 people working. Maybe 2 weeks for the basics. I am not planning anything fancy, just 4 walls, a roof, a chimney, and a door. I can add windows and a proper floor later. 2 weeks, Robert repeated. He had planned to stay a day or 2 at most, just long enough to make sure the wagon axle held and Nora was settled. But looking at the work ahead and thinking about her trying to do it all alone, he heard himself say, I will stay. Help you build it. Nora's head whipped around, her eyes wide. What? No, Robert, you cannot do that. You have your own life, your own work. I cannot ask you to give up 2 weeks for me. You are not asking, I am offering. But why? This does not make any sense. You do not owe me anything. In fact, I owe you. So why would you stay here in the middle of nowhere helping me build a cabin when you could be in town making real money? Robert set down the canteen, trying to find words for feelings he did not fully understand himself. Maybe because for the first time in 3 years, I do not feel empty. Maybe because watching you fight for this dream reminds me that I used to have dreams too. Or maybe I am just tired of drifting, and this seems as good a place to stop as any. The honesty of his words surprised him as much as they seemed to surprise Nora. She stared at him, emotions flickering across her face too fast to name. "I cannot pay you," she said finally. "I barely have enough money left for supplies to get through winter." "I do not want your money. The same deal as before. You feed me, I work, that is all. That is not fair to you." "Let me worry about what is fair to me," Robert said quietly. "Truth is, Nora, I have got nothing better to do and nowhere better to be, so if you will have me, I would like to stay and help." Nora's eyes were suspiciously bright, and she looked away quickly, blinking hard. "You are either the kindest man I have ever met or the craziest. Probably both." That startled a laugh out of her, watery but genuine. When she looked back at him, there was something in her expression that made Robert's heart beat faster. "All right," she said, "you can stay. But only if you promise me that this is what you want, not what you think you should do. I do not want your pity or your guilt. I want a partner or nothing at all." "Partners," Robert agreed, offering his hand. Nora shook it, her grip firm and warm, and Robert felt something shift between them, some invisible line being crossed. They were not strangers anymore, not just two people thrown together by circumstance. They were choosing this, choosing each other, at least for now. And for a man who had convinced himself that tomorrow would always be empty, that choice felt like a revolution. They worked through the afternoon, falling into an easy rhythm. Robert had built enough lined shacks and temporary structures over the years to know the basics of construction, and Nora's knowledge of woodworking filled in the gaps. She was a quick study, adapting to his suggestions while offering her own ideas. It felt less like teaching and more like collaboration, two people working toward a common goal. As the sun began to set, they cleaned up, and Nora started preparing dinner. Robert tended to the horses and gathered more firewood, making sure they had enough to get through the night. The temperature was dropping steadily, and he could smell snow in the air. Winter was coming fast, and Nora was right to push hard on getting shelter built. Dinner was a stew made from dried beef and vegetables, thick and warming. They ate in comfortable silence, the fire crackling between them. The stars were emerging again, that vast expanse of light that made the world feel both infinite and intimate. "Can I ask you something?" Nora said, setting down her empty bowl. "Depends on the question. Your brother, what was he like?" Robert tensed, his automatic response to shut down the conversation warring with a new impulse to share. He stared into the fire, watching flames dance and flicker. "His name was James," he said finally. 2 years younger than me. He was the good one, the one who always saw the best in people. I was the serious one, the one who worried and planned. Together we balanced each other out." "What happened to him?" "Card game in Abilene. Some drunk accused him of cheating, which was ridiculous because James was terrible at cards. Too honest to bluff worth a damn. But the man was spoiling for a fight, and James tried to calm him down. I was at the bar getting drinks, did not even see it start, just heard the shot." Robert's voice went flat, the words coming automatically like he was reporting facts rather than reliving the worst moment of his life. "He died before I could reach him. The man who shot him got away in the chaos, never found him, never even knew his name." "That is horrible," Nora said softly. "I am so sorry, Robert. I should have been there. Should have been paying attention instead of flirting with the bartender. If I had just stayed at the table, maybe I could have stopped it. Maybe James would still be alive. Or maybe you would both be dead," Nora said gently. "You cannot know how it would have gone differently. All you know is what happened, and it was not your fault. Feels like it was. I know. But feeling it and it being true are not the same thing." Robert looked at her, this woman who had survived her own betrayals and losses, who had every reason to be bitter but instead chose to hope. "How do you do it? How do you keep believing things can be better?" Nora considered the question seriously. I do not know that I believe things will be better exactly. I think I just refuse to believe they will always be worse. There is a difference. I cannot control what happens to me, but I can control how I respond. And I choose to respond by building something, by creating a life that is mine, by refusing to let the past steal my future. She paused, poking at the fire with a stick. When I left Georgia, I was so angry. At Marcus, at my circumstances, at the world for being unfair. And that anger kept me going for a while. But somewhere along the way, I realized that anger was not enough. If I wanted to actually live, not just survive, I had to find something to move toward, not just something to run from. So I decided to build a home, to make something with my own hands that no one could take away from me. And that promise, that vision of what could be, that fills the emptiness. Robert felt something crack open in his chest, some wall he had built to keep the pain in and the world out. I have been running, he admitted. For 3 years I have just been running, telling myself there was nothing worth stopping for. And now, Nora asked. Robert met her eyes across the fire, seeing his own loneliness and longing reflected back at him. Now I am not so sure. The moment stretched between them, heavy with things unsaid. Robert wanted to cross the distance, wanted to touch her hand or her face, wanted to find out if her lips were as soft as they looked. But he held himself still, afraid of rushing, afraid of ruining something that felt fragile and precious. Nora looked away first, her cheeks flushed in the firelight. We should get some sleep. Tomorrow is going to be another long day. You are right. Robert stood, banking the fire. I will take first watch again. No, Nora said firmly. We alternate. I took the late shift last night, so it is your turn to sleep first tonight. Robert wanted to argue, but the determined look in her eyes told him it would be pointless. All right, but wake me at midnight. I will. Robert lay down on his bedroll, watching Nora settle onto the log with a blanket wrapped around her shoulders. She looked small against the vastness of the prairie night, but not fragile. Never fragile. She was steel wrapped in softness, strength disguised as gentleness, and Robert was starting to realize that he was falling for her. The thought should have terrified him. He had spent 3 years avoiding connections, avoiding anything that could lead to caring, because caring led to loss and loss led to the kind of pain he did not want to survive again. But lying there under the stars, listening to Nora hum softly to herself, Robert found that the fear was still there, but it was no longer enough to stop him. Tomorrow, he had been convinced, would bring only emptiness. But Nora Grant had filled that emptiness with her promise, her vision of something better, her refusal to let the past define her future. And if she could do that, if she could build a home and a life out of nothing but determination and hope, then maybe he could too. Maybe tomorrow did not have to be empty after all. The days that followed fell into a pattern that felt both foreign and strangely right to Robert. They would wake with the sun, eat a quick breakfast, and work until the light failed, breaking only for brief meals. The cabin took shape slowly, post by post, beam by beam. Robert's hands, which had been idle for so long, remembered the rhythm of hard physical labor, and he welcomed the ache in his muscles, the calluses forming on his palms. Nora worked beside him every step of the way, never complaining, never slowing down. She learned quickly, adapting her wheelwright knowledge to the demands of construction. Robert found himself teaching her how to notch logs, how to check for level and plumb, how to think 3 steps ahead in the building process. And she taught him things too, shortcuts her father had shown her, ways to work smarter instead of just harder. They talked while they worked, small conversations at first, sharing stories about their pasts that felt safe. Robert learned that Nora had once wanted to be a teacher. that she loved to read but had sold most of her books to afford the train ticket west, that she was terrified of spiders but would not admit it to anyone but him. She learned that he had once considered becoming a lawman in earnest, that his favorite food was his mother's apple pie though he had not tasted it in years, that he sang surprisingly well when he thought no one was listening. The conversations grew deeper as the days passed, moving beyond safe stories to harder truths. Nora told him about the year she spent engaged to Marcus, how he had slowly tried to chip away at her independence, questioning her choices and undermining her confidence until she started to doubt herself. She told him about the night she finally fought back, the fear and exhilaration of leaving everything she knew for a future she could not predict. Robert told her about James, really told her, not just the facts of his death but the memories of his life. He talked about growing up together, about the plans they had made to buy a ranch someday, about the way James could make anyone laugh even in the darkest moments. He told her about the guilt that haunted him, the crushing weight of feeling like he should have died instead. "Survivor's guilt," Nora said one evening as they sat by the fire. "That is what Doc Henderson would call it. You are punishing yourself for being alive when your brother is not." "Maybe," Robert admitted. "Feels like more than that, though. Feels like I failed him." "You did not fail him, Robert. Life failed both of you. Life is random and cruel sometimes, and bad things happen to good people for no reason at all. That is not your fault. Knowing it and believing it are different things." "I know," Nora said softly, "but you have to try. Because James would not want you to waste your life feeling guilty. He would want you to live really live, not just survive." Robert knew she was right, but letting go of the guilt felt like letting go of James, and he was not ready for that. Not yet. Maybe not ever. But being here, building something tangible with Nora, it helped. The work gave him purpose, and her presence filled the silence that had become so oppressive. He started to notice small things again. The way the morning light painted the cottonwood leaves gold, the taste of fresh coffee, the satisfaction of a log fitted perfectly into place. The world was still hard and often cruel, but it had beauty in it too, moments of grace that he had forgotten to look for. By the end of the first week, the cabin's frame was up, and they had started on the roof. It was demanding work that required careful coordination, and Robert found himself hyper-aware of Nora's presence. The way she moved, the sound of her voice, the rare moments when she would laugh at something he said. He was falling for her, he knew that now, and the knowledge filled him with equal parts hope and terror. Hope because, for the first time in 3 years, he wanted something for his future beyond just the next job or the next town. Terror because wanting something meant risking loss, and he did not know if he was strong enough to survive that pain again. One afternoon, as they were taking a break from shingling the roof, Nora turned to him suddenly. "Why did you really stay, Robert?" He had been expecting the question or something like it, but he still was not sure how to answer. "I told you, I did not have anywhere better to be." "That is not a reason, that is an excuse. You could be in Cheyenne right now, working a regular job, sleeping in a real bed, eating in a restaurant. Instead, you are out here in the middle of nowhere helping me build a cabin." "Why?" Robert set down the shingles he had been holding and met her eyes. "Do you want the truth, always? Because when I am with you, I do not feel empty. And I have felt empty for so long that I had forgotten what anything else felt like." Nora's breath caught, her eyes searching his face. "Robert, I know I am no good for you," he continued, the words tumbling out before he could stop them. "I am broken and angry, and I do not know how to let go of the past. But being here with you, it is the first time in 3 years that I have wanted a tomorrow. You did that. Your promise, your dream, your stubborn refusal to give up, It filled something in me that I thought was dead. You are not broken, Nora said fiercely. You are hurt, and that is different. Hurt can heal if you let it. Can it? Robert asked, wanting desperately to believe her. Instead of answering with words, Nora crossed the distance between them and took his hand, lacing her fingers through his. Her palm was rough with calluses, warm and solid and real. I am scared too, she said quietly. Scared of caring about someone again, scared of being hurt, scared that this thing between us is moving too fast and I am going to wake up and regret it. But I am more scared of letting fear stop me from taking a chance on something good. And you are good, Robert Sullivan, whether you believe it or not. Robert looked down at their joined hands, feeling something fundamental shift inside him. All his life, he had been the strong one, the one who took care of others. And then James died and he had convinced himself that strength meant not needing anyone, meant facing the emptiness alone. But standing here with Nora, feeling her hand in his, he realized that maybe real strength was allowing yourself to be vulnerable to hope, to care even when it scared you. I have not been good in a long time, he said roughly. But with you, I want to try to be. Nora smiled, and it was like the sun breaking through clouds. Then try. That is all I ask. Just try. Robert lifted his free hand slowly, giving her time to pull away, and cupped her cheek. Her skin was soft despite the roughness of the wind and sun. She leaned into his touch, her eyes drifting closed. "Can I kiss you?" he asked, his voice barely above a whisper. "I was wondering when you were going to ask," Nora murmured. Robert closed the distance between them, pressing his lips to hers gently, carefully, like she was something precious that might break. Nora made a soft sound and deepened the kiss, her free hand coming up to rest against his chest. She tasted like coffee and hope, and Robert felt the last of his walls crumbling, leaving him exposed and terrified and more alive than he had felt in years. When they finally pulled apart, both breathing hard, Nora rested her forehead against his. "Well," she said, slightly breathless. "That was worth waiting for." Robert laughed, the sound rusty but genuine. "Yeah, definitely yeah." They stood there for a long moment, holding each other while the wind whispered through the cottonwoods and the river sang its endless song. Robert felt something settle in his chest, some piece of himself clicking back into place. He was still scared, still scarred by loss, but Nora was right. Being hurt was different from being broken, and maybe with her help he could learn to heal. They went back to work after that, but something had changed. The air between them felt charged, electric with possibility. They found excuses to touch, hands brushing as they passed tools, shoulders bumping as they worked side by side. And that night after dinner, Nora did not retreat to her tent immediately. Instead, she sat close to Robert by the fire, her head resting on his shoulder while they watched the stars emerge. "Tell me about your dreams," Robert said softly. "Not just the farm, but everything. What do you want your life to look like 5 years from now?" Nora was quiet for a moment, thinking. "I want to be self-sufficient. I want fields of wheat and corn, a vegetable garden, maybe some chickens and a cow. I want to wake up every morning knowing that I built this with my own hands, that it is mine and no one can take it away. And I want to feel safe, truly safe, in a way I have not felt since my father died." She paused, then added softly, "And I think I want someone to share it with. I have been telling myself for so long that I do not need anyone, that I am better off alone. But that is not really true. I am strong enough to be alone, but I do not know if I want to be. Not anymore." Robert's heart hammered in his chest. "Are you saying what I think you are saying?" Nora lifted her head to look at him, her eyes reflecting the firelight. "That depends on what you think I am saying. I think you are saying that maybe there is room in your dream for someone like me, if I was interested, which I am. Are you?" Nora asked, her voice holding a note of vulnerability that made Robert's chest ache. "Because I need you to be sure, Robert. I cannot do this halfway. I have been hurt before, and I swore I would never put myself in that position again. But if there is a chance that this could be real, that you could stay not just for 2 weeks but for longer, then I am willing to risk it. But only if you are too." Robert thought about the life he had been living, the endless drifting, the towns that all blurred together, the jobs that meant nothing. He thought about the emptiness that had consumed him for 3 years, the conviction that tomorrow would always bring more of the same. And then he thought about the last week and a half, the satisfaction of building something, the warmth of Nora's smile, the feeling of purpose that had been missing for so long. "I am terrified," he admitted. "Of caring, of losing, of all of it. But I am more terrified of walking away and spending the rest of my life wondering what could have been. So yes, Nora, I am willing to risk it. I want to stay, not just to finish the cabin, but after, if you will have me." Nora's smile was brilliant, lighting up her whole face. "I will have you, Robert Sullivan. I will absolutely have you." She kissed him then, fierce and joyful, and Robert wrapped his arms around her, holding tight. This was what hope felt like, he realized. This dizzying combination of fear and excitement, the willingness to risk pain for the chance at something beautiful. They talked late into the night, making plans and dreaming out loud. Robert told her about his savings, money he had accumulated over years of working with no one to spend it on. It was enough to buy supplies for the winter and more, enough to invest in the farm and make it a real working operation. Nora protested at first, insisting she did not want his money, but Robert convinced her that it was not charity but partnership. "If I am staying, then this is my dream too now," he said. "Let me invest in our future, not just yours, our future." The words felt strange and wonderful in his mouth, a promise of tomorrows that were not empty but full of possibility. The days that followed were some of the happiest Robert could remember. They finished the cabin's roof and started on the walls, chinkling the gaps with mud and moss to keep out the wind. They built a stone chimney that took 3 days and tested their patience repeatedly, but finally drew properly. They installed a door and shutters for the windows, making the space feel more like a home and less like a shelter. And through it all, they talked and laughed and learned each other. Robert discovered that Nora sang while she cooked, that she was ticklish behind her left knee, that she had a temper when frustrated but cooled down quickly if left alone. Nora learned that Robert was methodical to a fault, that he had a dry sense of humor that caught her by surprise, that he was surprisingly gentle despite his size and rough exterior. They also learned each other's bodies, stolen kisses turning into longer embraces, desire building slowly like a fire carefully tended. Robert had been with women before, brief encounters that meant nothing and were forgotten quickly. But this was different. This was Nora, and everything about her mattered, from the way she sighed when he kissed her neck to the flush that spread across her chest when he whispered what he wanted to do with her. They made love for the first time in the completed cabin, on a bed Robert had built from cottonwood logs, and Nora had covered with blankets and quilts. It was awkward and wonderful, full of nervous laughter and whispered reassurances. Robert had been worried about hurting her, knowing she had bad experiences with men, but Nora guided him with patience and trust that humbled him. Afterward, lying tangled together in the darkness, Nora traced patterns on his chest. "I love you," she said softly. "I know it is fast. I know we have only known each other a few weeks, but I love you anyway." Robert's throat tightened with emotion. "I love you too. I did not think I could feel this way again, but you proved me wrong." "Good," Nora murmured, already drifting toward sleep. "I like proving you wrong." Robert held her as she slept, listening to the wind outside and the crackle of the fire in the new chimney. The cabin smelled like fresh cut wood and Nora's cooking, homey and welcoming. For the first time since James died, Robert allowed himself to think about the future without the crushing weight of emptiness. There were still hard times ahead, he knew that. Winter would be difficult and farming was never easy, but they would face it together, and that made all the difference. The first snow came in early November, light flurries that dusted the prairie white. They had worked frantically to finish the cabin and get it ready for winter, building shelves and a table, fashioning stools from stumps, making the space livable. Robert rode into Cheyenne once to buy additional supplies and to send a telegram to a rancher he had worked for previously, explaining that he would not be available for the spring cattle drive. The words felt significant, a choice made and a future claimed. When he returned to the cabin, loaded down with flour and sugar and other necessities, Nora met him at the door with a smile that made the long ride worthwhile. "Welcome home," she said, and Robert realized that was exactly what it was. Home. Not a place to sleep between jobs, but a real home with a woman he loved and a future they were building together. They married in late November, a simple ceremony in Cheyenne with Doc Henderson and Sarah Mitchell as witnesses. Nora wore a new dress she had sewn herself, simple but lovely in deep blue calico. Robert had traded for a suit that actually fit and a ring, a simple gold band that he slipped onto her finger with hands that shook slightly. "I promise to fill your tomorrows with more than emptiness," he said, the vow coming from his heart rather than any traditional ceremony. "I promise to build a life with you, to stand beside you through whatever comes, to love you until my last breath." Nora's eyes were bright with tears. "And I promise to remind you that tomorrow can be beautiful. I promise to be your partner, your friend, your home. I promise to love you through the hard times and the good forever." The justice of the peace declared them married, and Robert kissed his wife, his Nora, with joy bubbling up in his chest. They celebrated with a small dinner at the boarding house, surrounded by the few friends Nora had made in Cheyenne. It was not fancy, but it was perfect, exactly what they both needed. Winter settled in earnest after that, snow falling heavily and temperatures dropping well below freezing. But the cabin Robert and Nora had built held strong, the walls solid and the chimney drawing clean. They spent their days working on small projects, making furniture and tools, preparing for spring planting. Robert hunted when the weather allowed, bringing back rabbits and occasionally a deer to supplement their supplies. Nora cooked and sewed and planned, drawing out garden layouts and crop rotations on precious paper. The long winter nights they spent together, talking by the fire or reading aloud from the few books they had. Sometimes they would just sit in comfortable silence, Nora knitting while Robert repaired tools or worked on some carving project. It was domestic and peaceful, a life Robert had never imagined for himself, but now could not imagine living without. There were hard days too, times when the cold seemed endless and supplies ran low, when they worried about the horses or the integrity of the roof under heavy snow. There were nights when Robert woke from nightmares about James, gasping and shaking, and Nora would hold him until the panic passed. There were moments when Nora would grow quiet and distant, old fears resurfacing, and Robert would give her space while making sure she knew he was there. But they worked through it together, learning each other's patterns, finding ways to support without smothering. And slowly, Robert felt the guilt that had haunted him for 3 years begin to loosen its grip. He would never stop missing James, would never forget the brother he lost. But with Nora's help, he was learning to carry that grief without letting it define him, to honor James's memory by living fully rather than by dying slowly. Spring came late but glorious, the snow melting to reveal prairie grass already greening underneath. Robert and Nora celebrated by plowing their first field, working together to break the tough prairie sod and prepare the earth for planting. It was back-breaking work, but satisfying in a way that Robert had not experienced before. This was not work for someone else's profit or someone else's dream. This was theirs. Every seed planted an investment in their shared future. They planted wheat and corn, potatoes and squash, a kitchen garden full of vegetables and herbs. Nora had a talent for growing things, coaxing life from the soil with patience and care. Robert built fences and a small barn, expanded the chicken coop they had started in late winter, and traded work with neighbors who had started settling in the area for a cow and calf. The work was constant and demanding, but Robert thrived on it. For the first time in his adult life, he was building something lasting, creating a legacy that would outlive him. And doing it beside Nora, watching her dream take shape, filled him with a contentment he had not known was possible. Summer brought long days of sunshine and hard work, the fields growing tall and green. They hired a young man from town to help with the harvest when the time came, a quiet teenager named Sam who reminded Robert painfully of James, but in a good way, a reminder that life continued, and good people still existed in the world. In August, Nora told Robert she was pregnant. She said it casually while they were weeding the garden like it was no big thing. Robert dropped his hoe and stared at her. "You are what?" Nora looked up, a smile playing at the corners of her mouth. "Pregnant, with child, expecting. I am pretty sure I am about 3 months along." Robert's mind went blank with shock and then exploded with 1,000 emotions at once. Joy, terror, excitement, fear, all of it crashing over him in waves. "Are you sure? How do you know? Are you all right?" "I am sure. I know because my monthly courses stopped and I have been sick every morning, and yes, I am fine. Better than fine, actually. I am happy, Robert. Are you?" Was he happy? Robert searched his feelings, examining the fear and finding beneath it a deep well of joy. A baby. Their baby. A child who would grow up knowing love and safety, who would never doubt that they were wanted. A future made tangible in the most profound way possible. "I am terrified," he admitted. "But yes, I am happy. So happy, Nora." He pulled her into his arms, careful suddenly of her body, of the life growing inside her. Nora laughed and hugged him back, fierce and strong. "We are going to be parents," she said, wonder in her voice. "We are going to be terrible at it," Robert said, "probably. But we will be terrible at it together, and we will love this child with everything we have. That is what matters." Robert kissed her, tasting salt and sweetness, tasting the future. A year ago, he had been alone and convinced that tomorrow would bring only emptiness. Now he had a wife, a home, and a child on the way. Nora had filled his emptiness with her promise, her dream, her stubborn refusal to give up on hope. And in doing so, she had saved him. The harvest that fall was good, better than they had hoped for a first year. They sold enough wheat to pay their debts and buy supplies for the winter, with enough left over to start a small savings. Robert built an addition onto the cabin, a second room that would serve as a nursery, working with quiet intensity as Nora's belly grew. She bloomed in pregnancy, her skin glowing and her energy inexhaustible despite the physical demands of her changing body. Robert watched her with awe and something close to worship, marveling that this strong, beautiful woman had chosen him, had trusted him with her heart and her future. Their son was born in late February, during a blizzard that trapped them in the cabin for 3 days. Nora labored for hours, fierce and determined, while Robert helplessly tried to help, following the instructions from a medical book they had bought in town. When the baby finally emerged, squalling and red-faced, Robert cut the cord with shaking hands and placed the tiny boy on Nora's chest. "He is perfect," Nora breathed, tears streaming down her face. "Look at him, Robert. We made this." Robert could not speak, his throat too tight with emotion. He touched one tiny hand, watching in amazement as miniature fingers wrapped around his much larger one. This was his son, his child, a piece of him and Nora made manifest. The enormity of it crashed over him, the responsibility and the joy and the terrifying, wonderful knowledge that his life was forever changed. "What should we name him?" Nora asked. Robert had thought about this, had wrestled with it for months. Part of him wanted to name the baby James, to honor his brother's memory. But another part of him worried that would be a burden for the child, growing up in the shadow of an uncle he would never meet. "What about Thomas?" he said finally. "It was my father's name. He was a good man, even if I did not always appreciate him when I was young." Nora smiled. "Thomas Sullivan, I like it. Strong and solid like his father. And stubborn like his mother," Robert added, making Nora laugh. They spent the 3 days of the blizzard holed up in the cabin, learning their son, marveling at every yawn and stretch. Robert had never felt so useless and so necessary at the same time, Nora needing him in ways that had nothing to do with strength or competence, and everything to do with presence and support. When the storm finally broke and the sun emerged, Robert stepped outside into a world transformed by snow. The prairie stretched white and clean in every direction, the sky brilliantly blue. He stood there in the cold, breathing in air that hurt his lungs, and felt gratitude wash over him so powerfully that he sank to his knees. He had been so lost, so convinced that his life was over in every way that mattered. But Nora had found him, or he had found her, and together they had built something beautiful. A home, a family, a future worth living for. "Thank you," he whispered to the sky, to James, to whatever force had brought him to that broken wagon on a dusty road outside Cheyenne. "Thank you. The years that followed were not easy, but they were good." The farm grew and prospered, Robert and Nora learning through trial and error, through hard work and stubborn determination. They added more land when they could afford it, built a bigger barn, acquired more livestock. Thomas grew into a bright, curious boy with his mother's determination, and his father's steady nature. 2 more children followed, a daughter named Sarah after Sarah Mitchell, who had become like family to them, and another son they named James. Robert finally ready to honor his brother's memory without the weight of guilt. The cabin was expanded multiple times until it was more house than cabin, filled with noise and life and love. Robert never forgot the man he had been, empty and drifting, convinced that tomorrow held nothing worth hoping for. But that man felt like a stranger now, someone from another lifetime. The man he was now had roots, deep and strong, anchored by Nora's love and the family they had built together. On their 10th anniversary, Robert and Nora stood on the porch of their house, watching the sun set over their land. The children were inside, arguing over some game, their voices carrying through the open windows. The fields were golden with wheat ready for harvest, and the garden was lush with late summer vegetables. It was everything they had dreamed of and more. "Do you remember that day I broke down on the road?" Nora asked, leaning into Robert's side. "Every detail," Robert said. "You were so fierce, so determined not to need help even though you clearly did." "And you were so sad," Nora said softly. "I could see it in your eyes, all that grief and emptiness. I almost sent you away because I did not think I had the strength to deal with my own pain and someone else's too." "What changed your mind?" Nora was quiet for a moment. "You helped anyway. Even though you were hurting, Even though you had no reason to care about some stranger's problems, you helped. And I thought, if this man can show kindness when he is suffering, maybe there is hope for both of us." Robert kissed the top of her head. "You saved me, you know. I was drowning and did not even know it, but you threw me a line and pulled me back to the world." "We saved each other," Nora corrected. "I gave you a reason to hope, but you gave me a reason to trust. We filled each other's emptiness." Robert thought about that, about the way two broken people had found each other and built something whole. "Do you ever regret it? Taking a chance on a drifter with too much sadness and not enough sense?" Nora turned in his arms, her eyes warm and full of love. "Not for a single second." "You are the best decision I ever made, Robert Sullivan. You and this life we built together. Even when the well ran dry and we had to haul water for 2 weeks. Even then. Even when Thomas broke his arm falling out of the tree and we had to ride through a thunderstorm to get to the doctor. Even then. Even when the chickens got out and terrorized Sarah until she cried," Nora laughed. "Especially then. That was hilarious." Robert pulled her closer, breathing in the scent of her hair, soap and sunshine and home. "I love you, Nora Sullivan. I will love you until my last breath and beyond." "Good," Nora murmured, "because you are stuck with me. This life, this love, this promise we made to each other. It is forever." "Forever," Robert agreed and kissed her as the sun sank below the horizon, painting the sky in shades of gold and red and purple. The children called from inside, needing something, and Nora pulled away with a laugh. "Duty calls." "It always does," Robert said, but he was smiling. They went inside together, into the warm light and noise of their home, their family. And Robert thought again, as he did almost every day, how close he had come to missing all of this. How easily he could have refused to help a stranger with a broken wagon, could have sent Nora on her way and continued his empty drifting. But he had not, and she had not sent him away. Instead, they had taken a chance on each other, on hope, on the possibility that tomorrow could be more than empty. And that choice had changed everything. Years later, when Robert was an old man with gray in his hair and creases around his eyes from a lifetime of smiling, he would tell his grandchildren the story of how he met their grandmother. He would describe the broken wagon, the stubborn woman with determined eyes, the cabin they built together with their own hands. And he would tell them the most important part, the truth that had taken him too long to learn. "Tomorrow does not have to be empty," he would say. "Sometimes tomorrow is full of possibility, of love, of dreams made real through hard work and hope. Sometimes tomorrow brings a chance to become more than you were, to build something beautiful with someone brave." And if you are very lucky, he would tell them, you meet someone who fills your emptiness with their promise, who shows you that the future can be bright even when the past is dark. "That is what love does," he would say. "It fills the empty places. It makes tomorrow worth believing in." And looking at Nora across the dinner table, surrounded by the children and grandchildren they had raised together, Robert would catch her eye and smile. She would smile back, and in that moment, everything they had been through, all the hardship and the joy, the fear and the hope, would shine between them like gold. The years continued to pass, bringing with them the inevitable changes of time. The children grew and found their own paths, some staying close to the land and others venturing into town for different trades and professions. Thomas took over much of the farm work as Robert's body began to slow, proving himself as capable and hardworking as his parents had been. Sarah married a schoolteacher and moved to Cheyenne, returning often with her own children for visits that filled the house with noise and laughter. James, the youngest, showed a talent for horses and started a small breeding operation on the edge of the property. Through it all, Robert and Nora remained the center, the the foundation upon which the family had been built. They aged together gracefully, their love deepening rather than fading with time. The passion of their early years mellowed into something even more profound, a partnership so complete that they often knew what the other was thinking without words. On quiet evenings, they would still sit on the porch together, watching the sunset over the land they had tamed and tended for decades. Nora's hair had gone silver, and Robert's hands were gnarled with arthritis, but they still reached for each other, still found comfort in the simple contact of palm against palm. "You remember being afraid?" Nora asked one evening, her voice soft in the gathering dusk. "Of what?" Robert asked, though he knew, of this, of us, of hoping for something more. Robert thought back to that first day, standing in front of the broken wagon and looking into the eyes of a woman who would change his life. "I remember. I was terrified. Thought I would lose you like I lost James, thought caring would destroy me. But it did not." "No," Robert agreed. "It saved me instead." Nora squeezed his hand. "We saved each other." It was their old refrain, the truth they returned to again and again. Neither of them had been whole when they met. Robert had been hollowed out by grief, convinced that feeling nothing was safer than feeling everything. Nora had been armored by betrayal, determined to need no one, to prove that she could survive alone. But they had both been willing to risk, to hope, to believe that tomorrow could be different from yesterday. And it had been. Oh, how it had been. Robert died on a cool autumn morning, surrounded by his family, Nora holding his hand. He went peacefully, slipping away between one breath and the next, his last sight the face of the woman who had given him back his life. And his last thought was gratitude, profound and overwhelming, for every moment they had shared, for every tomorrow that had been full instead of empty. Nora grieved as anyone would, but she did not break. She had loved deeply and been loved deeply in return, had built a life and a legacy that would outlast her. She lived for several more years, watching her grandchildren grow, tending her garden, keeping the house and the land that she and Robert had carved out of the Wyoming prairie. And when her own time came, she went with a smile on her face and Robert's name on her lips, ready to join him wherever souls went when the body gave out. The family buried them together beneath the cottonwood trees they had loved, the same trees that had sheltered their first camp and witnessed the building of their cabin. It was fitting, a circle completed, but their story did not end there. It lived on in the children and grandchildren who carried their names and their values, who had learned from their example that love was not weakness but the greatest strength of all. It lived on in the land itself, in the fields still planted and harvested, in the house that had grown from a simple cabin, in the lives that had been shaped by two people brave enough to hope when hope seemed impossible. And sometimes, on quiet autumn evenings when the light slanted golden across the prairie, those who lived in the house Robert and Nora had built would swear they could feel something in the air, a presence, a warmth, a sense of profound peace. They never spoke of it, but they all knew. It was Robert and Nora, still watching over the land they had loved, still present in the home they had made, still proof that tomorrow does not have to be empty if you are willing to fill it with promise. Their love story was not grand in the way of fairy tales or legends. There were no kingdoms saved or dragons slain, no dramatic rescues or sweeping gestures. It was the story of two ordinary people who found each other when they both needed finding, who chose to hope when hopelessness would have been easier, who built a life one day at a time with nothing but hard work, determination, and love. But perhaps that was what made it extraordinary. Not the destination but the journey, not the perfection but the persistence, not the absence of fear but the courage to act despite it. Robert had been convinced that tomorrow would bring only emptiness, that he was broken beyond repair, that the best he could hope for was numbness and survival. And Nora had filled that emptiness with her promise, her vision of something better, her refusal to let the past dictate the future. Together, they proved that tomorrow could be full of possibility, that love could heal even the deepest wounds, that building something beautiful required nothing more than willing hands and hopeful hearts. They proved that it was never too late to change direction, never too late to choose hope over despair, never too late to believe in the promise of a better tomorrow. And in doing so, they left a legacy far greater than land or money or even the family they raised. They left the knowledge that love, true love, was not about finding someone perfect, but about finding someone willing to build perfection together, one imperfect day at a time. They left the understanding that emptiness was not a permanent state, but a temporary one, something that could be filled if you were brave enough to let someone in. The house stood for generations, expanded and renovated but never abandoned, always home to someone who understood its significance. The story of Robert and Nora was passed down like a precious heirloom, told and retold until it became part of the family mythology. And each time it was told, the message was the same. Tomorrow does not have to be empty. Love can fill the hollow places. Hope is not naive but necessary. And sometimes, on a dusty road outside a growing town, two people who need each other more than they know will meet, and everything will change. That was Robert and Nora's gift to the world, their promise kept and shared. And long after they were gone, that promise lived on, filling emptiness with hope, one heart at a time, one tomorrow at a time, forever and always.